The expectations are very high, I feel, right now, especially with the youthful aspect of the opposition. They're really calling for some major changes, whether it's better distribution of wealth, new jobs, better income for civil servants. It's going to be very difficult for a country like Egypt or Tunisia to try and raise those issues while at the same time responding to the popular pressure for increased subsidies. And how do you increase salaries for police force and civil service and have and give the private sector the opportunity to develop new jobs? So it will be, I think, a period of also trying to improve the expectations and to explain to people that certain steps will have to take place before things really begin to change. In terms of the risks that we face in the region, I think, I'm sure that nothing new to tell you here except that, if this doesn't work out into a transitional period, we will probably see, not necessarily the same autocratic regimes. You'll see a Mubarak light, if I can put it that way. I mean, there is a potential for that to happen, that the transition will not be able to go directly to a very open democratic system. In both Tunisia and in Egypt, they have significant Islamist forces. Many of the ones in Tunisia were in exile. They've all come back. They do have a very strong religious and social network in both Egypt and Tunisia, and they will have to be incorporated. Of course, the advantage they have over secular parties is that they are always much better organized because they've had the network of the mosques, and so they will be ahead of the game in both of those countries. Anytime you have a breakdown of public order, we of course face the possibility of terrorist groups flourishing, as we saw in Iraq a couple of years ago. I wanted to go through each country very quickly and just kind of give you a snapshot of where I think they are now. And I threw in some figures because the comparisons are so different. But the one statistic that I think stands out for Egypt is, forget how many are below poverty level. Just remember, 40% are earning less than $2 a day. I think that just says it all in terms of the incredible gap between the very rich and the very poor in Egypt. The distribution of wealth is, since Mubarak came in and since Sadat came in, we've had the opening of the private sector, and you go to Egypt now and you either see billionaires, in the outskirts of Cairo and many of those gated communities, and then you go into Cairo or outskirts of Cairo and you see the people who are surviving on $2 a day. The middle class in Egypt has shrunk over the last 10 years instead of grown, in spite of their significantly robust economy. Egypt grew at a rate of 6% last year, but you see a shrinking middle class. Again, Tunisia is better off in that area, where you have a very large and quite strong middle class. One of the many things Mubarak did, which I think were actually good for the country, is that he did pursue economic reform. I think the last 5 to 10 years, maybe it slowed down, but they did do a lot of work on that side. He had a series of good technocratic cabinets that focused on economic reform. They privatized a lot of the state-owned factories and industries, and now, of course, with the regime being discredited, his economic policies are also discredited, which I think is unfortunate. And we might see actually a regression where the next government is going to be a little more socialist in tone in response to the popular demand of how can we have a better living and increase subsidies, increase salaries of government employees, and so on. Again, the factor of the military institution, I think, is out there, especially in Egypt on the economic side. I put this point in here because by some estimates, they control a third of the Egyptian economy. They have a very large business side of the military, and of course they support the military with money they make from their private enterprise. But they enjoy many, many perks that I think will be hard for them to give up. For example, they don't pay taxes, many of their industries. So now in Egypt right now, what's happening is just this last week, a new caretaker cabinet was appointed, quite an impressive group of people, I must say, from the new prime minister. I think his first name is Assam, I'm not sure, but it's Sharaf. And of course, Nabil Al-Arabi now is the foreign minister, a very, very highly respected diplomat. So they have, I think, a much better cabinet now that's both acceptable to the military and acceptable to the opposition groups. They're talking about constitutional amendments. They've already drafted them. And I think they'll have a referendum this week or next week. And now the whole question of parliamentary and presidential elections in Egypt is, I think, going to be critical. And many of the opposition, and I would agree, are hoping that the presidential elections will be first and not the parliamentary elections. Because the parliamentary elections really need a lot of time to prepare and field candidates and so on and set up the electoral system. Otherwise, the existing former ruling party, the National Democratic Party, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan Muslimin, are likely to be very dominant in the parliament if the elections are done right away. So I think we're all hoping to see that delayed. Tunisia, again, a slightly better picture than Egypt, but a lot of issues both on the economic side. And but again, the transition period has been, I think, incredibly successful thus far. They've managed to throw out all the old figures from the regime. The current prime minister is somebody in his 80s, so obviously he doesn't have a lot of political ambitions, sees himself as a caretaker. He's a former foreign minister, very respected. And they have basically, taken out the constitution. They're going to draft a whole new constitution. And one of the much, much hated security police units was just disbanded this week. So again, they seem to be moving, I think, in the right direction. Libya, a sad story, as we heard from their ambassador yesterday. Really, again, very different system than Tunisia and Egypt. You had a tribal leader who had a very strange way of governing. There were no institutions, there are no institutions in Libya to speak of. Even their military, totally unprofessional, untrained, more militias than they are military. There are no political parties in Libya, no parliament, no civil society to speak of. He ruled the country by a series of committees, of course, of people he appointed that were completely loyal to him. So now we have this new interim national council. The ambassador spoke quite a bit about that group yesterday. And they seem to be made up again of kind of a hodgepodge of individuals, not even groups, because they don't have any institutions. But Gaddafi has a lot of resources and obviously has mercenaries and his own supporters. And I think we're going to see, the ambassador last night didn't come out and say, a divided Libya, but almost. For now, at least, certainly Eastern and Western. But will it be formally divided with the international community recognizing an interim government on the Eastern province? I have no idea how that will go. There's a lot of talk of international intervention. He made a very, very powerful plea last night, the Libyan ambassador, saying that they want the international community to impose a no-fly zone. And I think for the international community, it's really a dilemma. First of all, they don't know the interim national council. Again, there's this issue of, well, who are they? But obviously some discussions going on in the UN, but this remains to be seen whether it will really break down into a full-fledged civil war and whether the international community will intervene. Yemen, I think the one I'm most worried about after Libya would be Yemen. Saleh, again, a tribal leader, but not even in control of all of Yemen. As we know, there's a secessionist movement in the south, and of course the northern Houthi rebels close to the Saudi border. But looking at Yemen today, my guess is going to be that either they will find a way to do a transition before the end of this year, or we will see again continued violence. And of course, Yemen has a number of issues that we're concerned about. The Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, very strong in Yemen. A lot of countries very concerned about that, not only our country, but countries like Saudi Arabia, very worried about that. So I think Yemen is a very dangerous situation and will need to be watched very carefully. Saudi Arabia, I don't really consider Saudi Arabia as being under threat in terms of its regime or the ruling family of Saud. I do think that the succession issue is probably their Achilles heel, because that is, I mean, King Abdullah is quite popular. He's the closest thing to a reformer in Saudi Arabia. He's done, I mean, he's taken some, what we would consider in the West, maybe not very significant steps, but within the Saudi context, he's made some incredibly important reforms. But the rest of the, the family is not as reform-minded as King Abdullah. The Crown Prince is extremely ill, so not a likely successor. So the whole succession issue, I think, is quite serious for Saudi Arabia. They've had some demonstrations, and they've had a number of petitions that were passed around calling for a constitutional monarchy, which is quite amazing that even these petitions saw the light, but they did. And of course, they look at their eastern province where their oil sector is, and also where the majority of their Shia population is, with some concern. And I think King Abdullah we will see some steps taken to appease some of the Shia demands. But the succession issue is what I would keep in mind. Bahrain, small country, but important for a number of reasons. Again, here you have a very different situation. You have a majority Shia country, 75%, with a very small Sunni minority, but they are the ruling family, Al Khalifa. They have taken some serious steps. The Crown Prince, who's very much respected, even by the opposition and by the Shia, has been now designated by the king as kind of the point man to go into a national dialogue and see what the demands are. So I think in Bahrain, first of all, the Saudis are so close to Bahrain that I don't think anything will happen to the ruling family in Bahrain, but I think they're going to have to compromise. I think there will have to be some compromises made and some reform made to appease many of the demands of their population.